our new sermon series, and our new sermon series is Bad Reputation. And this week it's about the woman caught in adultery. We're going to talk about King David. I forget some of the other people, but Gomar, I believe. Anyhow, I'm really excited about this because I am always drawn to these people in the Bible who have this horrible reputation, or at least seem to have this horrible reputation, and yet Jesus seems to be drawn to them too. And their stories are these stories of grace and forgiveness and love, and it's so easy to become one of these characters. So I'm really excited about this sermon series. So as you can see, the woman caught in adultery, and that's what we read earlier. But I'm going to start with a different story. And this story began as a story of young love between 19-year-old Zainab and her boyfriend. It was like most first romances, all day and all night text messaging, now. Arguing over who would be the first one to hang up the phone. I remember when Jason and I were first dating, because we had a long distance relationship, and we'd be on the phone saying, no, you hang up first, no, you hang up first. And we'd argue over who the first one would be to hang up the phone. Or maybe it's the jitters of holding hands for the first time. Or those awkward embraces. Or fun dates filled with friends and pizza and bowling. But the innocence of young love was lost on Zainab's father, Shaifia. And maybe you know how this young woman's story ends, because perhaps you've read about it in the news a couple of months ago. Because Zainab, along with her sisters, were found submerged in their car in the locks of Kingston, Ontario. She was killed, condemned to die by her father because of her relationship with another man. For this family, Zainab was guilty of bringing shame and pain to the family. And she was judged to be guilty with the ultimate penalty of death. And much like this story, there is a woman in the Bible whose story embodies the shame and the pain and the judgment of those around her. This is a story of failure. This is a story of abuse and pain, of exclusion. It's a story of condemnation. And the story begins with her in John chapter 8, the passage that we read earlier. And it's the woman stooped down on the ground, covering her face, hiding her shame in the middle of the circle. And the men circling around her are the religious leaders, the Pharisees. And these men see themselves as the self-appointed keepers of the law. And the other man in our story, the one seated on the ground, is Jesus. And Jesus has been teaching while this woman has been cheating. And yet their worlds are about to collide in a way that will leave her forever changed. And so we move back into the story, and we hear the incriminating accusation echo throughout the temple courts. Teacher, this woman was caught in the act of adultery. And with that accusation, there is silence. Because everyone in the temple courts knows what such an accusation means. They know how this story will eventually play out. So they sit and they wait for the inevitable death of this woman to take place. Caught in the act of adultery. The words alone are enough to stop you. The words alone are enough to make you feel suddenly uncomfortable, and embarrassed because of the pictures and images that flood your mind. Because doors are slammed open, covers are ripped off of two naked, embracing bodies in the act, in the moment, beneath the covers, in the private embrace of one another. Caught red-handed with a man that is not her husband. From a moment of passion and lust, the woman is ripped from a private embrace to a public rejection, as she is dragged throughout the streets. And she can see the disapproving faces of men and women who peek through their windows. Yet in many faces, the woman notices a look of distinct satisfaction. Because after all, no one in this community is surprised. This woman has a reputation, and it's not a good one. She has a reputation for sleeping around, for living in a life of sin. But she's embarrassed. And she pulls that thin cover around her shoulders tighter, attempting to cover her nakedness, to hide her shame, and to somehow conceal the pain in her life. But you see, no amount of adjusting of this cover will be able to hide her. Because from now on, she will be known as the adulteress. Everywhere that she walks, she will be followed by whispers, identifying her as the one who had sex with another man that was not her husband. She will be called by a litany of phrases that only describe her very worst mistake. When her name is mentioned, she will be remembered as the half-naked woman being dragged around town because she was caught in the act of adultery. But in this story, behind a thinly veiled plot that suggests that this woman is the main culprit in the story, there is something more lying underneath the surface. Because you see, the culprits in this story are not quite as obvious as a half-naked woman caught in the throes of passion. Because the other characters in the story, the Pharisees, these men know the law of Moses. And they know that two people must be witnesses to the erotic act of adultery. There had to be two witnesses. And as readers of this story, I'm sure you suddenly recognize a problem. Because how likely is it that two religious men stumble upon an erotic moment exchanged between two adults? So we're left to wonder, how long did the Pharisees stand there and wait and watch the couple? How long did they lurk behind a curtain until they finally revealed themselves? And of course, it does not take a genius to realize that adultery requires two participants. It's a necessary fact. But what happened to him? Did he manage to leave before they caught him? Or is there something going on here, more than what we could realize? In the biblical story, we find out that the motivations of the Pharisees are not left to our imagination for very long. Because in verse 6, we learn that the woman is a trap. She is a pawn in the Pharisees' game. She is only a small piece in their puzzle. She is not the catch. She is merely the bait. So the Pharisees and the scribes turn to Jesus and they ask him, in the law of Moses, it gives us orders to stone such a person. So what do you say, teacher? And with the question of the Pharisees, we begin to understand their motivation. Their questioning, it seems, has an ironic undertone because the respectful asking of a question is actually only a ploy. Because the Pharisees' question attempts to undermine all of Jesus' teaching with one small, seemingly insignificant question. Because now if he upholds the law, he contradicts his way of life and all of his teaching that he's done so far. But if he maintains his outlook and his preaching regarding sinners and denies Moses, he shows himself to be a lawless person. But to focus on all of that is to lose sight of the woman. The woman who we now understand is immaterial to the Pharisees, a dispensable part of their plan. And as we turn back to the woman, we see her there, stooped low to the ground. And she is so afraid. She is gasping for air. Her hair is covered in sweat, in dust, and in tears. And it is hanging in her face. It is cupped in her hands. Her lips are tight, and her jaw is clenched shut because she knows now what the plan is. Because she can see their hands. She can see the rocks clenched so tightly in their fists that their fingertips are turning white. And she knows that these stones of varying sizes are meant to be thrown at her. And she knows that when they get tired of chucking these rocks at her, they will take a boulder and they will smash it over her skull to ensure that she is dead. She knows now what is about to happen, and she has nowhere to run. She has no one left to turn to. At least, that's what she thinks. But this is not a story that ends in death. This is not a story that is played out in a courtroom where a person is in the end convicted of submerging and killing 3 young women in a car. This is a story where the unbelievable grace of God breaks in the midst of tears and sweat and dust. And I know a lot of you know this story really well. But don't let your knowledge allow you to be complacent, because Jesus' first move is subtle. So don't miss how critical his first response is. Allow yourself to feel the surprise as if you are there in that moment. Because Jesus, the Holy Son of God, stoops down. And he begins to draw in the dirt. He stoops down. Perhaps he shields the woman from the scornful stares of onlookers. And perhaps he whispers to her in that moment words of comfort. Whatever it is, Jesus lets this woman know that he is there. That in the end, she does have someone to turn to. That even though she may feel like no one loves her, he loves her. That he sees her for who she actually is. And as I was reading about this story, I learned that there were thousands and thousands of theories about what Jesus actually wrote or drew in the sand. But the truth is, the Bible just does not tell us what he wrote there. But what it tells us is that he stoops, that he bends down, that he lowers himself to the ground where the woman in her shame and in her guilt is lying. Jesus stoops down. He protects her.
He considers her disoriented. He stoops down and he writes, and as he writes in the sand, he speaks, "Any of you who have not sinned, go ahead. Go ahead and chuck the first rock at this woman." And these words of Jesus invaded the air and silenced all of the scornful onlookers around. And in the silence that followed, the accusers gave up their anger. They gave up their judgments. And the young looked to the old. And the old Pharisees challenged, searched their hearts. And suddenly the silence that was in the temple courts was broken by intermittent thuds. The sound of stones slowly being released and dropped to the ground. The stones that once were held so tightly in fists are now being loosened from each one of the accuser's hands. And the thuds of these stones are accompanied by the muffled sound of footsteps, of people turning away, one person at a time. Until finally the woman looks up and realizes that they are alone. And just as she realizes that they are alone, this man who is with her asks her, "Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you?" And with this question, she awaits his verdict. And so do we. Because we know that if Jesus wanted to, he could have thrown that first stone. He was without sin. Or maybe we think in this moment, Jesus will give her a good lecture on the importance of moral integrity and moral behavior. Or at least we think Jesus would demand an apology of this woman. And with all of these hesitations and expectations, the woman, still nervous, slowly turns to Jesus. She looks at him for the first time in the eyes and says, "There is no one here, sir." And Jesus, against our expectations, simply responds, "Neither do I condemn you." I don't understand what's happening over here. But that is not where Jesus leaves her. Free of condemnation, but left as an adulteress. Instead, Jesus imagines a whole new reality for this woman. And he says to her, "Go, go now, and sin no more." It is here, finally, at the end of the process, that Jesus addresses her behavior. Because he knows what we know as well. That her behavior is more likely to be transformed by his loving embrace, by his care and defense, than through fear of law and judgment, as real and as legitimate as they may be. Because Jesus knows what we instinctively know too, that love wins. When Jesus stooped down, when Jesus advocated for her, he won her heart. And she discovered that day on the Mount of Olives that Jesus was her place to belong. And this reality meant the beginning of new things for him, her. On the Mount of Olives that day, love won. Jesus stooped down. Jesus protected. Jesus considered the woman caught in adultery disoriented. And there is something in each one of us, I'm sure, that says, yes, yes, she was all of those things. But shouldn't Jesus have waited until she changed her ways? Shouldn't he have waited until tomorrow to make sure that she didn't sleep with some other man? Isn't Jesus, by forgiving her behavior, condoning her behavior? But if we take this line of thinking to its extreme, we would all be living in a hurt and broken world. Because what the gospel story seems to indicate is that Jesus came to each one of us while we were still sinners, not to condemn us, not to condemn the world, but to bring life. While we were still sinners, Christ died for us. He jumped into humanity, stooped down next to us, and protected us. Jesus came down and let us know that he was right there beside us, and he removed the condemnation. If Jesus' encounter with the adulterous woman teaches us anything, it reveals to us the unexpected truth that the safest place for a sinful person to go is to God. If you have ever wondered how God reacts to you when you fail, listen to these words. Neither do I condemn you. Go now and leave your life of sin. Ponder these words. Let these words wash over your soul. Drink in these words of life. God will neither condemn us, nor will he leave us in our brokenness. Wherever you are in your journey with Christ, invite him in. Invite Jesus into the darkest areas of your soul, to the places where you feel most alone and naked, and let him stoop down next to you. As you bear your shame, as you bear your pain, as you bear your guilt, Jesus is stooped down beside you, whispering in your ear a word of liberation. Because today, in this place, love wins. Jesus whispers to our hearts, I do not judge you guilty. Jesus offers his grace of forgiveness, which is accompanied by the grace of a new life lived in the Spirit of God. God stoops down next to us and tells us, break with your old ways of life, marked by condemnation and guilt. God invites us into a world that is marked by his love, by his freedom, and by his acquittal. As the worship team comes now, listen to God. Feel him stooped down beside you. Feel him protecting you, shielding you, telling you, I am here in this place now, in this moment. Listen for him whispering in your ear, I do not condemn you. For whatever it is that you have done, for whatever it is that you have thought, God says, I do not condemn you. But go now from this place today and leave your life of sin.